brother, sister. Somewhere in almost every extended family, there's an old, unresolved argument about cremation versus burial, quietly waiting for the next death in the family to bring it right back to the surface again. Here's what's worth naming clearly before we go any further into this. Scripture never actually issues a direct, explicit command settling this specific question one way or the other, no matter how confidently either side sometimes claims otherwise. Faithful believers throughout history and across many different cultures have practiced both, for different reasons, in very different circumstances, without either practice ever being treated as a settled matter of obedience or sin. And yet this specific disagreement has a unique, almost predictable way of turning families against each other, precisely at the moment they should be grieving together in unity. Today we're naming 6 ways people argue about cremation versus burial that quietly do more damage than the actual decision ever could. Patterns so common that many families have already lived through at least one of them without ever naming it clearly. This isn't about telling you which choice is correct. It's about protecting your family from turning a genuinely disputable secondary matter into a source of lasting bitterness and division. Stay with me. If your family has ever fought about this, you'll recognize more than one of these. Think about your own extended family's history with this topic. If it has one, maybe it's already surfaced once, at a previous funeral, and left a lingering tension nobody's ever actually resolved. Maybe it hasn't come up in your family yet, but you already sense which relatives hold strong opinions, and you already suspect how badly it could actually go when the moment eventually arrives. Either way, this particular conversation is worth having now, well before grief makes it far more difficult to navigate wisely and calmly. The first way people argue badly is declaring the other view unbiblical or sinful, with a certainty Scripture simply doesn't support. Cremation isn't biblical. Real faith requires burial. These statements get delivered with total confidence. But Scripture never actually issues a direct command on this specific question either way. Believers have been buried and cremated across centuries and cultures without either practice being treated as disobedience. Speaking with absolute certainty about a genuinely disputable matter doesn't make your position more faithful. It just adds unnecessary condemnation to a decision Scripture actually leaves open. Consider how differently these conversations would go if both sides simply acknowledged this genuine ambiguity from the outset. Instead of 2 people each convinced the other is disobeying God, you'd have 2 people navigating a real but disputable preference, with room for honest disagreement that doesn't require either side to be branded unfaithful. Manufactured certainty on a genuinely open question rarely produces clarity. It usually just produces division dressed up as conviction. The second way people argue badly is making the decision unilaterally, without honoring the deceased's own wishes or the wider family's input. Sometimes one family member simply decides, quietly or loudly, overriding everyone else, including explicit wishes the deceased may have expressed while they were still alive. This isn't really an argument about theology at all. It's a question of honoring both the dead and the living family members, who deserve a voice in the decision. Whatever the eventual choice, arriving at it through genuine honor and conversation matters as much as the choice itself. Notice how differently this decision lands on the rest of the family depending on how it was reached. A choice made through honest conversation, even if not everyone fully agrees with the outcome, tends to be accepted with far less resentment than the same exact choice imposed unilaterally by whoever happened to have legal authority or simply spoke first and loudest. The process itself shapes whether the decision becomes a source of lasting peace or lasting grievance. The third way people argue badly is weaponizing fresh grief to relitigate a disagreement that's actually been simmering for years. The funeral itself becomes the battlefield for an argument that predates the death entirely. Old family tension about faith, tradition, or control, finally erupting at the exact moment everyone is most raw and least equipped to handle it well. Grief deserves space to actually be grief. Using someone's death as the occasion to finally win a long-standing family argument turns a moment of mourning into a moment of conflict instead. Ask yourself honestly, if this pattern sounds familiar in your own family, is the current disagreement actually about this specific death? Or is it really about something older, something that simply found its most recent opportunity to resurface? Recognizing that distinction doesn't resolve the older tension, but it does prevent the funeral itself from becoming yet another casualty of a fight that was never really about cremation or burial in the first place. The fourth way people argue badly is judging someone's salvation or genuine faith based entirely on which choice they made. If they really trusted God, they'd choose burial. Cremation shows they don't really believe in the resurrection. These judgments quietly attach eternal significance to a decision Scripture never actually ties to salvation at all. God's power to resurrect was never dependent on the condition or location of a body. Turning this practical decision into a referendum on someone's actual faith says more about the person making the accusation than it does about the person being judged. Consider how this kind of judgment actually lands on a grieving family member, already carrying enough weight without having their loved one's eternal standing questioned over a practical funeral decision. Faith was never meant to be measured by burial method, and turning it into that kind of test adds spiritual cruelty to a moment that should be marked by comfort and shared grief instead. The fifth way people argue badly is public shaming, taking the disagreement online, criticizing family members' choices in front of an audience who has no actual stake in the decision. A social media post subtly criticizing a sibling's choice. A public comment thread where extended family and even strangers weigh in on what should have been a private family decision. This kind of public exposure doesn't make the disagreement more resolved. It just adds humiliation on top of grief, turning a private family matter into a spectacle for people who were never actually part of the decision in the first place. Consider who actually benefits when a family disagreement gets aired publicly this way. Rarely does the online audience offer anything genuinely helpful. Mostly they simply weigh in with opinions, take sides, or pile on to whichever family member has been publicly criticized. The family member being shamed gains nothing but public embarrassment layered on top of their grief, while the underlying disagreement remains just as unresolved as it was before. And the sixth, maybe the most quietly dishonest of all, disguising cost or convenience pressure as theological conviction. We should do what's cheaper. Besides, it's more biblical anyway. Gets said sometimes when cost, not conviction, is actually driving the decision. There's nothing wrong with financial wisdom playing a genuine role in funeral decisions. Grief shouldn't require needless financial strain. But dressing up a purely practical concern in spiritual language in order to pressure the family without having an honest conversation about cost quietly undermines trust at exactly the moment honesty matters most. Notice how much easier this conversation becomes once it's actually named for what it is. This option is significantly more affordable, and here's why that matters for our family right now. Invites honest discussion and genuine problem solving. This is the more biblical choice. When cost is the real driver, shuts down that same honest conversation, replacing it with a manufactured spiritual authority that the actual concern never needed in the first place. So what does it actually look like to navigate this decision well, without falling into any of these 6 traps? It looks like acknowledging genuine freedom in a matter Scripture leaves open, rather than manufacturing false certainty. It looks like honoring both the deceased's wishes and the family's voice in reaching a decision together. It looks like keeping old, unrelated family tension out of a moment meant for grief. It looks like refusing to attach eternal judgment to a practical choice. It looks like keeping family disagreements private rather than staged for an online audience. And it looks like being honest about cost concerns instead of dressing them up as theology. None of this means the decision itself doesn't matter, or that families shouldn't discuss it thoughtfully and prayerfully together. The choice between cremation and burial can genuinely carry real meaning for the people making it, shaped by theology, family tradition, personal conviction, and practical circumstance all at once. But how a family navigates this disagreement often matters more, in the long run, than which specific choice was ultimately made. Precisely because the relationships involved will need to continue functioning well long after the specific decision has already been settled and largely forgotten by everyone outside the immediate family. So if this conversation comes up in your own family, whether soon or someday, remember that unity in how you disagree matters, just as much as whatever you eventually decide. Here's a practical suggestion worth considering seriously, if your family hasn't already had this conversation. Talk about it now, before grief is in the room. A calm, unhurried conversation about final wishes, held long before anyone is actually facing a loss, tends to go far better than the same conversation attempted for the first time in the raw, emotional days immediately following a death. If the person whose wishes are actually in question can express their own preference clearly ahead of time, much of the potential conflict simply never has room to develop in the first place. If your family is currently in the middle of this disagreement, here's a simple diagnostic for each of these 6 patterns. For false certainty, can you actually point to a specific verse commanding one practice over the other? Or are you relying on tradition and personal preference dressed up as biblical mandate? For unilateral decisions, has everyone with a legitimate stake actually been consulted, or has one person simply decided and informed everyone else afterward? For weaponized grief, is this argument actually about the current death, Or is it really about something older resurfacing at a convenient moment? For salvation-based judgment, would you extend the same judgment to any other disputable matter in someone's life? Or is this decision being singled out unfairly? For public shaming, does this disagreement actually need an audience beyond your immediate family? Or is publicity simply a way of escalating pressure? For disguised cost pressure, if you removed all the spiritual language from your argument, would the actual practical concern underneath it still stand on its own honest merits? None of these questions are designed to settle which choice, cremation or burial, your family should actually make. That decision genuinely belongs to your family, shaped by your own convictions, circumstances, and wishes. What these questions are designed to protect is something arguably more important than the choice itself: the relationships that have to continue existing long after the funeral itself has ended, regardless of which specific decision was ultimately reached. Families that navigate this disagreement well tend to look back on it, years later, as a difficult but manageable conversation. Families that fall into these 6 patterns instead often carry the resentment far longer than they carried the actual grief, turning what should have been a shared act of honoring someone's memory into a wound that outlasts the funeral itself by years or even decades. If this stirred something in you, brother, sister, don't scroll past it. Subscribe to Biblical Warning now, and let's keep examining these hidden places together, one warning at a time.